Hey beautiful, have you considered subscribing to our channel? Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers.
The sun had barely crested over the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the orchard. The morning dew clung to the leaves like tiny diamonds, and the air, fresh with the scent of ripening fruit, filled the lungs with a kind of peace that only a secluded patch of land could offer. For the protagonist, whose life was entwined with this land, the orchard was not just a piece of property. It was a sanctuary, a livelihood. Each row of trees held memories. Each branch represented hard-earned growth. It was everything to them. But that morning something was off. A faint hum broke the serenity. Music. From somewhere deep in the orchard, it spilled over the land, loud, upbeat, and unmistakably the sound of a party. The protagonist frowned. No one had asked for permission. No one had said anything about a gathering here, in the place where their crops depended on the tranquility. They grabbed a jacket, buttoning it quickly, heart already pounding with a sense of dread. As they walked toward the source of the noise, it only grew louder, more jarring. The sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and boisterous voices mixed with the beat of bass-heavy music that felt like an assault on the morning calm. When they finally reached the clearing, they stopped dead in their tracks. There, in the middle of the orchard, dozens of white party tents were set up in rows, their sides fluttering in the breeze. Fairy lights twinkled like stars, strung between the posts, and the scent of grilled meat hung in the air. A handful of people moved between the tents, setting up tables and chairs, oblivious to the fact that they were intruding on private property. At the center of it all stood Karen. Karen, the woman who, for as long as the protagonist had known, her had been a problem, a neighbor, but not the kind anyone would want. Entitled, self-important, and with an innate ability to turn any minor inconvenience into a personal affront, Karen had earned her place as the protagonist's nemesis. Today, however, she wasn't just an inconvenience. She was an invasive force. The protagonist's jaw tightened. They had been anticipating a peaceful, productive day. The crop dusting was scheduled for noon. The chemicals were vital to ensuring the harvest. Without it, the crops would be in serious jeopardy. And now Karen, with her usual disregard for anyone else's plans, had decided that today was perfect for throwing a party in the very spot the spray would need to cover. As they stormed toward the nearest tent, Karen spotted them, and her eyes lit up with a mixture of surprise and smug satisfaction. "Oh, you're here!" she called, waving a hand. "I was just thinking your orchard could use a little life. It was so quiet before." The protagonist stopped just a few paces away, staring at her in disbelief. "What is this?" they asked, their voice thick with growing frustration. Karen beamed as though the question were a silly formality. "A celebration, of course. You didn't think I'd throw a party without letting you in on it, did you? I know how much you love being social." The protagonist clenched their fists at their sides. "Karen, this is my property. You can't just set up a party here. I've got crop dusting scheduled for this afternoon. It's vital. You need to pack up." Karen's smile didn't falter. She placed her hands on her hips and stood taller, as if she were the one in charge. "Oh, I'm sure it's important, but I've already sent out invitations. People are already on their way. It's too late to cancel now." The words felt like a slap to the face. The protagonist had always known Karen had no sense of boundaries, but this was something else. She was actively sabotaging their livelihood for the sake of a party. They took a deep breath, trying to calm the burning frustration in their chest. "I'm serious, Karen. I need you to clear out," they said, their voice tight with control. "This isn't just a minor inconvenience. The spraying can't be done around all these people. You have to move." Karen's eyes sparkled with the kind of defiance only the truly entitled could muster. "I'm not sure why you're making such a big deal out of it." The orchard's not even being used, right? What's the harm in a little fun? The protagonist fought the urge to scream. The nerve. The absolute nerve of this woman. The harm is that this land is my business. It's my livelihood. Your fun is directly affecting my ability to take care of it. Karen looked unbothered, tilting her head in mock sympathy. Well, I guess we all have to make sacrifices. Besides, a little dust won't hurt anyone. It's just a party. Calm down. She waved her hand dismissively, as though the matter were settled. The protagonist felt their blood pressure spike. They had worked too hard, too long, to watch someone like Karen destroy it all out of ignorance and entitlement. They opened their mouth to argue further, but stopped themselves. It was clear Karen wouldn't listen. Logic, facts, the importance of the spray. None of it would matter to her. She would do whatever she wanted. Consequences be damned. For a moment, the protagonist stood frozen, considering their options. They could call the police, but Karen was adept at playing the victim. The thought of more legal battles, more wasted time, made their head throb. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an assault on everything they had built. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way to handle it. A smarter way. The protagonist turned away, their heart heavy with the frustration of being ignored. Once again. Karen's smug face burned in their mind, and as they walked back toward the house, the first faint seeds of a plan began to form. They weren't going to let this slide. Not this time. As they walked back to their property, a cold sense of resolve settled over them. Karen had just made her biggest mistake. The protagonist spent the next few hours pacing around the house, the weight of Karen's defiance still pressing on their chest like a stone. The morning had promised so much, a peaceful start to what should have been an ordinary day. But now, every time they closed their eyes, all they could see was Karen's arrogant smile, her dismissal of everything that mattered. The orchard, their livelihood, was being toyed with like it was a mere backdrop for a selfish party. And worse, she wasn't even remotely concerned with the consequences. They grabbed their phone, scrolling through the numbers for the crop dusting company. The spray was essential. Without it, the crops would be vulnerable to pests, the harvest would suffer, and the hard work of months would go to waste. They needed that spray. Karen's party wasn't just inconvenient, it was threatening. Everything they had worked for. The call went through. The protagonist's voice was steady, controlled, though their mind raced. They explained the situation, asking if the schedule could be adjusted, perhaps pushed forward a bit to avoid the interference. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, understanding. "We can make it work," the dispatcher said. "We'll get there just after lunch. Shouldn't be any problem." Relief washed over the protagonist, but it was short-lived. They still had Karen to deal with. The party tents were still up, and the guests, oblivious to the damage they were about to cause, continued to pour in. The protagonist could almost hear the faint sound of the bass thumping in the distance. But now, they had a different kind of plan forming. A better plan. They sat down at the kitchen table, their minds sharp as they turned over the possibilities. It was clear by now that confronting Karen directly hadn't worked. She wasn't going to listen to reason. She didn't care about the orchard, the crops, or even the impact her actions had on anyone else. She had her own agenda, and nothing was going to change her mind. But there was one thing Karen couldn't stand: being embarrassed. She had a fragile ego, and she thrived on being seen as the center of attention. The protagonist had seen it before, how she fawned over guests, how she manipulated situations to make herself appear superior, how she put on a show for anyone watching. If they could turn the tables on her, expose her for the inconsiderate, entitled person she was, that might just do the trick. It wouldn't be enough to just let her waste the day with her party. The protagonist needed to make sure Karen would feel the weight of her actions. They needed something public, something irrefutable. The protagonist pulled out their laptop and began to scroll through the neighborhood's online forums. It didn't take long to find a few neighbors who had already voiced their displeasure with Karen's behavior. It was a small town, and the residents were tightly connected. What would happen here would spread quickly. And some people, especially the ones who had been wronged by Karen in the past, would love to see her taken down a notch. They typed out a post. "Planning a big party in the orchard, huh? Hope everyone knows it's in direct conflict with a crucial crop dusting that's essential for the harvest. Let's see if she's more concerned about her fun than the future of the crops." The post was sharp but vague enough to intrigue. Before sending it, they paused. This wasn't just about making Karen look bad to a few neighbors. They needed more than that. Something bigger. A wider audience. They had an idea, one that would use Karen's own vanity against her. A quick call to a local influencer. A friend of a friend was all it took to set things in motion. The protagonist explained the situation, how Karen's party was not only disrespectful, but potentially damaging to the entire orchard. The influencer, familiar with Karen's antics, was eager to help. "I'll make sure to be there. I'll share it with everyone. We'll turn this into something that gets noticed." With that, the first phase of the plan was set. The next was the most delicate part. Timing. They couldn't let Karen know what was coming. They had to wait for the right moment. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the party continued in full swing. Karen, no doubt, was basking in the attention of her guests. The loud music carried over the orchard, blending with the buzz of voices. The protagonist stood at the edge of the property, looking out over the tents. It felt like a mockery of everything they'd worked for. The crop dusting was still a few hours away, but the plan was already in motion. The protagonist set the phone to record. They knew the moment the dusting began, everything would shift. The spray wouldn't be a subtle whisper across the land. It would be a statement. And Karen would get a front-row seat to the consequences of her carelessness. They walked back inside and sat down by the window, watching as more guests arrived. Soon enough, the first shots of spray from the crop-dusting plane would begin. The protagonist's stomach twisted with anticipation. There was no turning back now. Karen had made her choice. And now, she was about to learn that her thoughtless, arrogant behavior came at a cost. The plan had been set in motion, and by the end of the day, she would know exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of public consequences. The wait felt like an eternity. The protagonist sat by the window, eyes fixed on the growing crowd of people gathered in Karen's makeshift party. Their mind raced, heart pounding in anticipation. The time was almost here. The crop dusting was scheduled for a little after lunch, and the protagonist had ensured that the video would be ready. They'd seen enough of Karen's antics to know that this moment, this confrontation, would not only hit her ego, but it would also hit her reputation in the neighborhood and beyond. Outside, the music had grown louder, the guests more boisterous. The sun was high, and the scent of grilled food wafted through the air, mingling with the heavy, earthy smell of the orchard. The whole scene was an affront. The orchards, with their perfectly lined rows of fruit-laden trees, had always represented something sacred, something hard-earned. And now, in this moment, they were being desecrated, ignored in favor of a selfish, careless celebration. The protagonist's fingers gripped the phone in their hand, the recording app open and ready. They watched the planes in the distance, circling. The buzz of the engine grew louder, a familiar sound, one that should have been calming in its purpose. But today, it was a harbinger. It was the moment that would either save their crops or wreck Karen's day. Or maybe, just maybe, both. The first pass of the plane wasn't subtle. The unmistakable sound of the dusting began, and the fine mist of chemicals began to blanket the land. It wasn't long before the wind carried the spray into the edges of Karen's tents. At first, no one noticed, but soon enough the faint smell of chemicals began to mix with the perfume of the grill, and the first few partygoers looked up in confusion. A few squinted against the fine dusting in the air. Karen, always alert for anything that threatened her control, was the first to react. She stood tall in her little gathering, trying to maintain an air of authority, though her face began to twist with irritation. "What is that smell?" she asked, looking around. "Is someone spraying something?" The protagonist couldn't help the slight smirk that tugged at their lips. The moment they'd been waiting for had arrived. Karen took a few steps toward the edge of the party, scanning the sky. She turned her head in the direction of the planes, still circling the orchard. She narrowed her eyes, then shouted to one of her guests, "Can you see if someone is spraying something over there? It's getting on everything." The guests looked confused, some shielding their faces from the fine mist now falling gently across the rows of tents. Karen, however, didn't wait for them to investigate. Instead, she stormed toward the protagonist's house, eyes blazing. By now, the dusting had begun to coat the branches of the trees, the fine mist shimmering in the sunlight. The protagonist's heart raced in time with their thoughts. It was working. Karen was about to get a taste of what it was like to disrespect the land. Karen reached the house just as the protagonist stepped onto the porch, phone still recording. She halted in front of them, hands on her hips, face flushed with frustration. "What the hell is going on? Why is everyone being sprayed with... What is that? Is this your doing?" Her voice was a mixture of accusation and panic, but there was a glint in her eyes. She wasn't just mad, she was losing control of the situation. The protagonist, calm as ever, locked eyes with her. "It's crop dusting, something I had scheduled for weeks. Your party's right in the middle of it." Karen's face twisted with disbelief, and she threw her arms up. "You've got to be kidding me! This is my property too, you know! How could you let this happen? You're ruining everything!" The protagonist shook their heads slowly. "I didn't let it happen, Karen. You did. You've been warned about this. You didn't care when I asked you to move the party, and now it's too late." Karen's voice went sharp, her tone turning venomous. "I don't care about your stupid crops. This is my party, my day. You can't just ruin it like this. Do you know who I am?" Her hand swept over the gathering behind her, as though they were her personal audience. "I will have you arrested for this." The protagonist resisted the urge to roll their eyes. Karen's sense of entitlement was nearly palpable. She hadn't even realized the situation was far beyond her tantrums now. The dusting was necessary, the crops were at risk. But Karen didn't see it that way. She only saw a threat to her fun, her image. With the phone still recording, the protagonist took a step closer, lowering their voice just enough for Karen to hear, but for no one else to catch on. "It's not just about your party. It's about the bigger picture. You didn't respect the land. You didn't respect the consequences of your actions." The protagonist's words were cold, but pointed. "And now everyone's going to know how you treat your neighbors. They're going to know what kind of person you are." Karen sneered, clearly not understanding the gravity of the situation. "Oh, please. No one cares about your silly little crops. This is nothing but a small inconvenience." The protagonist, heart racing with a sense of impending justice, allowed a brief pause. "Let's see how you feel when the footage of this goes viral," they said, their voice laced with a hint of satisfaction. The realization hit Karen's face like a slap. Her eyes widened as she glanced toward the gathering, the guests already starting to move toward the edge of the party, pulling back as the spray began to settle on their clothes, on their food, on everything they were enjoying. The damage was done. The protagonists turned their back, heading toward the house again. "It's too late now, Karen. The damage has been done." Behind them, the party started to break apart, guests grumbling and cursing, unsure of whether to stay or leave, the atmosphere rapidly shifting from excitement to frustration. Karen, still frozen at the realization of what had just happened, could only watch as her carefully planned day began to unravel. And in that unraveling, the protagonist knew this was only the beginning. The party, once full of laughter and excitement, had now become a chaotic scene. Guests who had once reveled in the carefree atmosphere were now pulling back in confusion, some holding their drinks awkwardly, others swatting at their clothes as they realized what had just happened. The fine mist from the crop dusting clung to the fabric of their clothing, staining their faces, their hair, their food. The crisp aroma of freshly grilled meat was now thickened with the sour tang of chemicals. Karen's face, once flushed with self-importance, now drained of color. She watched, helpless, as the joy of her carefully orchestrated party dissolved in real time. Her guests, clearly uncomfortable, began to mutter to each other, their eyes flickering toward her, as though unsure whether to leave or confront her about the mess she had caused. The party, which had started as her domain, was slipping through, her fingers like sand. But she was Karen, and Karen didn't let go of control easily. Her voice cut through the murmur of complaints, straining to sound authoritative, though it faltered in the face of mounting frustration. "What are you all doing? Get inside the tents. Stay out of the spray. This isn't my fault. We're having a party." The panic in her tone was unmistakable. The once dominant woman now seemed small, her brittle facade cracking under the weight of the situation. She turned toward the protagonist, fury and disbelief written across her face. "You think this is funny? You think this is some kind of game? You're going to pay for this, you hear me? I will ruin you." But the protagonist didn't flinch. Their eyes were steady, unmoving, like a predator watching its prey. The satisfaction of having orchestrated this, of seeing Karen finally confront the consequences of her actions, was almost overwhelming. But they kept their composure, knowing the final act was still to come. "You can't ruin what's already been done, Karen," they said calmly, their voice cutting through the noise like a razor. "You didn't just ruin my harvest. You've ruined your own reputation. You can't blame me for this." Karen took a step toward the protagonist, her face twisted in anger. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning. I've got connections. I'll have you fired. I'll make sure you never work again." Her voice cracked with rising panic. "You've messed with the wrong person." The protagonist held their ground. "You've already lost, Karen. I'm not worried about my job. I've got plenty of people who know exactly what happened here today. And it won't take long before everyone hears about it." Behind them, the sounds of Karen's guests were growing louder, murmurs of indignation and frustration. The protagonist could see that the tide was turning. No one was paying attention to Karen's frantic attempts to salvage what was left of her party. She was fading into the background, her attempts to control the narrative slipping through her fingers. The more she raged, the less credible she became. The protagonist took one last look at the gathering. The video, which had already been uploaded to social media, was spreading faster than wildfire. It showed Karen, in all her entitled glory, screaming at the protagonist, oblivious to the damage she had caused. Guests were shown walking away, shaking their heads in disbelief, while Karen stood in the middle of it all, shouting threats and accusations. The protagonist smiled, just a small, knowing curve of their lips. This was more than just a public spectacle. This was the kind of humiliation that Karen thrived on avoiding. She had built her life on a veneer of control, but today, in front of everyone, her facade was exposed for what it truly was: fragile, empty, and hollow. Karen's eyes flickered toward her phone, as though hoping to call in reinforcements. But it was too late. Her image was already tarnished. The post was already circulating. The neighborhood forum was flooded with comments, some mocking, others simply stunned by her audacity. The local influencer, who had arrived just as the chaos began, had posted the footage to her massive following, and the commentary was brutal. "Who throws a party in the middle of an orchard's crop dusting?" one comment read. The entitlement is off the charts. Another. Is this woman for real? She's literally causing environmental damage and thinks she's the victim. The protagonist had played their part expertly. The video had done its job. Karen's deflection tactics, her self-righteous anger, were only making her appear more out of touch, more out of control. And now, standing there, watching her unravel, the protagonist finally allowed themselves a moment of triumph. Karen's outbursts were growing more desperate. "You think you've beaten me? I'll—" She faltered as she looked around, realizing that no one was listening anymore. The guests were already leaving, making their way to their cars, some muttering apologies to the protagonist as they passed by. The final nail in the coffin came when one of the guests, a woman who had clearly had enough, turned to Karen and said, "You know, I don't know if I want to be associated with someone like you anymore. You've ruined everything. I'm out." Her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, and the others quickly followed suit. One by one, the remaining guests filtered out, leaving Karen standing in the middle of her failed celebration, the promise of a good time turning to dust around her. Her face, once flush with anger and confidence, now looked like the face of someone who had lost everything. She stood there, mouth agape, her eyes darting around as if searching for a lifeline that would never come. But it was too late. The protagonist turned and walked away, leaving Karen to face the consequences of her own making. As they left the orchard behind, the distant sound of Karen's shouting became less and less distinct. There was no more need for confrontation, no more need for words. The moment had passed, and Karen's fate had already been sealed. The protagonist felt a sense of calm, knowing that this victory, while sweet, had come at a great cost. But it had been worth it. The orchard, their livelihood, was safe, and Karen, for all her bravado, had learned the hard way that nothing, absolutely nothing, would stand in the way of their resolve. And with that, the protagonist disappeared into the distance, their mission complete, their enemies defeated, and their legacy secure.